Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and good morning. My name is Jason Green from Hexigent Consulting, and today I'll be walking us through a presentation that we've politely titled Cybersecurity, Digital Investigations, and the Unsung Heroes of Incident Support. By way of background, I'm a 30-year cybersecurity professional, and I'm one of the principals at Hexigent Consulting, which is a digital forensic and cybersecurity firm based here in Oakville, which is just outside of sunny Toronto in Canada. So with that being said, we'll proceed. So what I'd actually like to do as part of this webinar is really talk about the mindset of cybersecurity and look to sort of demonstrate how more informed decisions are possible when using investigative methods, and provide a possibly different perspective when considering, as we've politely said, sort of the unsung heroes, the individuals that provide support when there is an incident. Some will be obvious, and more importantly, some will not be. So with that in mind, when considering cybersecurity in general, there's a number of things that are fact. These haven't changed much throughout my career, and so I suggest that they will likely continue to be relevant. Now, what I'm going to provide here is a list of 5 things that I see as fairly important to be knowledgeable about, and although applying a different lens to these will allow for sort of a more diverse approach. So the first thing to consider is, a vulnerability is always going to be exploited. The speed of change in technology and the way in which we use it has meant that vulnerabilities appear continuously. Bad guys or bad code, bad luck, or even bad karma means that we just see a steep uptick in operational impacts. And when we consider vulnerabilities, we typically, as security professionals, consider these to be technical in nature. However, I encourage all parties, from a business side, from the security side, to consider that the vulnerability could be anything else. Could be human, could be a process, a procedure, a chink in the armor somewhere. So it's one of the key things that we always in the security field consider to be very important. Any vulnerability will be exploited. Second, everything is vulnerable in some way. Fort Knox, my laptop, the White House, all have one or more weaknesses. And our broad thinking is always that with enough time and effort, these weaknesses can be found. And when that happens, it's generally just a matter of time before the inevitable, unfortunate situation will occur. And what we find is that vulnerabilities that we as professionals spend a long time trying to find can be stumbled across by third-party threat actors. And so we don't apportion the amount of effort it takes for us to find something to the likelihood that a bad guy might actually step into it somehow. So it's always something to consider when you're building your security program or looking at your business. Assume everything is vulnerable, go find what it is, and then figure out how to close that gap. Third thing is, in any security program that I've ever been part of, or we've ever worked with clients to try and address, one thing always holds true: the human element is the weakest link. And essentially, it's because we as human beings are actually programmed to think in certain ways. And because of that, that can be used against us. Essentially, we're designed to help our fellow man or woman, and we generally trust in totality everything before we actually before we stop to consider whether it's the right thing to do or not. The fourth thing is that innovation leads to exploitation. And by that, I mean that in cyberspace, essentially, as things improve, generally things again get worse. And here we're really considering functionality versus security. So if we consider some of the more modern innovative tools, techniques, methods, and approaches towards security, they can involve things like machine learning or similar cutting-edge technologies. And since they're not always fully understood, but they are embraced by organizations, that can sometimes lead to vulnerabilities becoming relevant or becoming present, which in turn will lead to exploitation by third parties or inadvertent exploitation by internal members of the organization. It's just a long-standing game of chicken and egg when we consider it from a security perspective. And the last thing to consider from the cybersecurity side of things is, when in doubt, go back to number one. Everything, every vulnerability will be exploited. So no matter where you are in the life cycle of your security program, you must always consider that that number one thing is the top thing to look at. And and as I mentioned earlier, most people, when they see this type of list, they look at it through a technical lens. They think of servers and systems, applications and devices. But if we reconsider it from a governance perspective, they could, just as an example, there could easily be a vulnerability in your governance model. It's not just a technical perspective that you should add to this. And really, it's just, think a little bit bigger than just technology. So that's the first piece about the cybersecurity element. Let me just move forward. There we go. So what we want to do is just put a very simple approach to the cybersecurity problem. So how do we actually look at it? And while there are many articles that detail how this should be addressed, and there are many ways in which we can we can review our security programs, we've tried to just simplify it. So provide you with just a very simplified approach. 4 steps, 4 things to do, consider at a high level. All of them have more granular components behind them, however. So the first one is, identify the crown jewels. So as any organization, the question becomes, what is it you're trying to actually protect? What are the important things to your business? Identify what those things are, and then start to consider the value of each one and the level of protection that each one warrants, which leads us to number 2, which is essentially protect the assets themselves. So once you've identified what it is that you're trying to protect, you need to then come up with a set of controls that are both detective and preventative and are in direct correlation to the threats that would apply to those crown jewels. Fairly straightforward, usually addressed in a controls framework of some sort. But these are the 2 key steps. Know what you're trying to protect, and then actually apply the right level of protection to it. Then thirdly, the detection of incidents. Have the ability in place to see when things start to potentially go wrong, to see when there are attacks against the business, against those crown jewels. Does integrity become a problem? Are things changing when they shouldn't? Do third parties potentially have access to it, or unauthorized individuals inside of your organization have inappropriate access? Are these things no longer available because the systems are starting to be shut down? Again, the ability to see this much in a very expedient manner will result in greater success. And then, fourthly, lastly on this piece, incident response. Have a plan, have a good plan to make sure that when things do actually go wrong, should they, and I always hope they don't for the sake of the entire audience here, but should there be an issue or an incident, have a way of putting the fires out quickly, be able to see what's going on, that's the detection piece, then be able to react to it. And don't just consider that the availability of an incident response plan is something that means that you're going to be able to effectively respond to an incident. You must test the plan. The parties involved, the human element, must know how to react. So everybody involved in the organization should have some knowledge of where they fit when an incident occurs. possibly based on the type of incident, possibly based on the data that has been accessed, but it must be something that becomes a cultural understanding, and behaviors and traits must be embedded. So having that plan is always one of the ideal goals. So moving forward a little bit, this all sounds very simple, I'm sure, and it sounds straightforward. But what are we actually trying to achieve here? What is the cyber objective when you're an organization trying to protect the business? Well, ultimately, we actually want to help folks inside of the businesses that we work for to make informed decision and keep the lights on. So what we're trying to do here is essentially, and this is our definition of it, what is the objective? It's mature processes, methods, tools, and skills, all working in unison with a common goal. So that means you're looking to build the organization through all of those different dimensions to the point where they can manage and protect the business, comply with all the regulatory requirements or legislative requirements they have those right tools and right skills, and be working silently to protect the organization. And ultimately, when we look at a definition of what that means, it's, if you do this right, it results in the 3 wells. Very well-trained people, following well-developed procedures, who are using well-implemented technology. And breaking those down, it means, yes, you've got the policies and procedures in place, the right ones, the meaningful ones, not the ones that sit on the shelf, but ones that are reviewed on a fairly regular basis and are simple enough that new members of staff or new members of any organization can easily understand what is meant by them and what it is that they need to do. So you apply the right level of training to ensure that those people actually can follow those procedures. And the well-implemented technology, since we're talking about cyber, and technology is obviously a significant piece of it, it's making sure that all of your systems, your devices, your servers, that the tools that essentially manage and process your data, which is ultimately the lifeblood of your information, of your organization a majority of the time, making sure that that is well implemented, well secured, well controlled is paramount, especially if we're asking these very well-trained people to do safe things. They must do it in a safe manner on the right technology. So switching gears ever so slightly, what we wanted to do is apply also the lens around digital investigations. One of the spokes of that sort of cyber model that we put up of the 4 things that have to be done is incident response. And as part of that, and that is a very big part in today's society, because we all hear of those breaches on a regular basis. We see them in the news. We sometimes hear about them in our own organizations. We hear new legislation is coming in. Everybody's focusing on responding to incidents and putting the fires out. So we look at this spoke of sort of incident response of the digital investigation side, because ultimately when things do go in an unfortunate direction, forensic examiners are brought in to untangle the complexity of data level evidence, to understand what happened, how it happened, and give a true picture, an informed decision-making picture again, back to the business to help them to prevent it from happening again or getting back on their feet. So regardless of what it is, if investigation is needed, there are some things that are worth remembering. And much like cyber, that cyber list earlier, these things don't really change in my experience. So the first thing is, you can never have enough intelligence when you are working through digital investigations. Now, I don't mean that the examiners like myself actually need to be smart folks. I mean the availability of information. You need lots of information. In fact, you want to get all the data and all the information, or as much as you can, at the beginning of any investigation, because knowing what's relevant and knowing what can be put to one side is never clear at the very start of an investigation, and it needs some organization, needs some triaging. It's very, very important. So, never turn down the opportunity to gather some more intelligence, or digitally or otherwise, at the beginning of an investigation. Secondly, science is your friend. Digital forensics is a branch of forensic science. We follow in our world the same or very similar structure to that. And essentially a logical and structured approach is needed to make sense of things, especially when you have lots of intelligence per number one. And this science component is typically applied to ensure that all avenues are explored and that findings are derived. And it's an iterative process, a review of information, determination of its value, and then moving that on to an analysis or combination with other information is how this works. You do that, then you rinse and repeat and start again, and then you ultimately get to the point where you've received enough information or data that it's now relevant. Third thing is, tools are tools. There is no find evidence button. There are a lot of fantastic technology support tools, if you will, to assist with a digital investigation. They could be forensic tools, they could be network analysis tools. We hear a lot of managed detection and response type tools coming into the environment now. These are all wonderful. However, they aren't the piece a lot of the time that will solve the puzzle. You do need to have the right experience using those tools. As I've said, that there's no find evidence button. We aren't at the point yet, although I'm sure we'll get there, where we can just point a tool at an environment that we know has been breached and have it tell us exactly what happened, what the problem was, and how to fix everything. The reliance on tools is just there to support what a digital investigator is looking at. So they have to be very well versed in how to use them and contextually understand how their outputs combine with the outputs from other tools or from other sources inside of the business. Someone is going to court. We always consider that in any digital investigation, regardless of what it's for. Everything will need documenting. Everything must be well captured, because somebody's going to have to go to court, or you should always assume this, and to defend any activity that has taken place. If you're in an organization and you've unfortunately suffered a breach and you perform an internal investigation, it may be several years before there is, for example, a lawsuit, or before there is a reason to explore the results of that digital investigation in a formal setting. The investigator, the oversight committee for the investigators in general may have to come forward and demonstrate everything they've done with a very fresh mind. So capturing everything is vital. We spend a lot of time in the investigations world writing things down. It all seems very glamorous a lot of the time, and it's represented in common media such as movies and television shows that it's very fast-paced, and we move on. We solve everything in 42 minutes plus advert breaks, and then we move on. The reality is not that. We might have a frenetic set of activity for several hours while we're reviewing certain data, and then several hours of documentation to make sure we've captured it. So I'd always emphasize that if you're performing any form of digital investigation, however long you think it's going to take, double that time just from an administrative perspective, because that must be captured. It's vital. And the last thing here, caffeine and jazz seem to help. Well, that's one of the more amusing phrases that we have here in our labs. Yes, you have to be very alert all the time when you're performing investigation, and sharp. You can't allow the senses to be dulled in any way when you're looking at something that could be either life-changing or organizationally changing in any way, shape, or form. So here, yes, plenty of coffee as we're doing our work, and taking a break, stepping away. We always say in the incident response teams, you're going to have to rotate, because incident responders and digital investigators, we tend to enjoy the chase, and sometimes many hours can go by and we've been staring at the same screens. Well, learning how to self-pace and self-regulate and stepping away and coming back with fresh eyes is very important. So if you are leading, managing, or overseeing a digital investigation, keep an eye on your investigators, keep an eye on the people that are doing the work, and force them to actually take breaks periodically, and to to come back with fresh eyes. So team rotation, very important. So what I wanted to do now is just sort of draw out the digital investigation life cycle to start with. So the first thing is, there is essentially an incident or a need that comes up. There is a situation or some sort of circumstance that requires investigation. And once that has come to light, research begins typically. So the investigators will start looking at what's actually taken place, and they'll start to sort of try to understand a little bit more about the circumstances and situation. And based upon the information that they are finding, they build a hypothesis, because this is essentially science. And so, we have to come up with a hypothesis in a scientific manner to determine or to look at and either prove or disprove in that usual scientific way. We then experiment as investigators. Can we prove that hypothesis, or can we negate it and move on to the next thing? So we start to experiment. Is this the right side of things? Is it the right way this should go? And then we move to analysis, where we're actually performing deep technical analysis to validate things, to find out exactly what happened, and to start pulling all the pieces of the puzzle together. And then finally, we come up with a conclusion. And that conclusion may be that we don't know specifically what happened, or it might point to a smoking gun in the environment. The conclusions are always different. And this investigative life cycle is either at the macro level for the overall investigation, or it could be a small piece of it. It could be that an organization has suffered from an incident relative to ransomware, as an example, something very popular nowadays, unfortunately. And suffering from something like that might result in different levels of investigation taking place. There could be the network level, where we're determining how did a third party get into the environment to launch ransomware. Could be the technical level, looking at the ransomware itself and determining how it works. So this life cycle is relevant at both macro and micro level. And for the sort of scientists amongst us, there is actually a smaller iterative cycle within. Essentially, when we get to the analysis piece of this life cycle, if we determine that we don't have enough information, we go back to the research side again, and we start gathering more information, and we go round until we're comfortable that we can start to draw that conclusion for us. So that's more the technical level, if you will, of a digital investigation lifecycle. What I wanted to do is actually overlay the macro business level on top of this, to see sort of what's happening from that perspective. And we've got the technical and management awareness. So as the incident starts to move forwards, people actually understand a little bit more about what's happening. The business is starting to get involved. And then we have the triage and risk review component, and that's where the technologists are starting to get involved a little bit. The business might be looking at it through a lens of risk, and they might be starting to consider, well, who do we need at the table to solve this problem out? And then as the investigation moves through analysis, you start to draw some conclusions. If it's determined that there's actually a significant incident that's taken place, escalation starts to take place. Those incident response teams start to come to the table. And then ultimately, as we draw a conclusion to something, it could be that reputational management is needed. So we've determined there's a significant incident in some way, shape, or form, and somebody has to better help to broadcast that to the public, for example, in an organization. So what I want to do now is just flip to that same business view, but provide a little bit more context if possible. So, technical and management awareness, this is where we're getting the initial alerting from various sources. There's, initial notifications or understanding something is definitely wrong. It needs explanation. The incident and management approach is dusted off. And to my earlier comment, that can be something where, you have that incident management process hasn't been revisited for a long time. You wrote it 3 or 4 years ago, you put it on a shelf, everybody looked at it once. Well, not knowing exactly what has to be done can cause some issues right from the very start if people aren't familiar with what to do. Then the triage and risk review. And so, typically technical triage is being performed to validate sort of the notification or suspicions. Something's gone wrong and technical triage is required. This could likely involve second-line technical resources. People who are not just sort of help desk, but they start to move into the backroom guys in the organizations, the deep technologists. They're coming to the table, and as things are established, you're possibly switching to the sort of business stakeholders as well at the same time to perform ad hoc risk reviews or suspected impact assessments, really starting to build momentum through the incident, through the situation. Following on from that, there's incident response escalation, actual escalation. So ultimately, this is where you've realized there's an incident. The senior management team or the board is involved, and now decisions are starting to get made for a variety of reasons, all with different drivers. And one of the things that's key is that bias becomes a problem, we've found, when we start working with the business sometimes. So by bias, I mean that the CFO could be at the table and looking at it through the financial lens. What is the financial ramifications? Legal could be there as well, and they're looking at it probably from a compliance perspective. Operations are there, and they're concerned about the ability to keep functioning, to keep everything moving, to keep the lights on. They all have their own bias, and rightly so, because organizationally, that's why they are there, because they are excellent at their own respective pieces of the business. However, in an incident situation, that bias ultimately needs to be wiped away, because the idea is to look in a very cold way at the circumstances, what has transpired, what are its impacts across the board. Everybody has a voice, all our stakeholders, but this is one reason why crisis managers and breach coaches, two terms that are very common nowadays, are brought to the table, because they can look at things in an unbiased way and they can start to help manage the incident. And they're considering everything from the technical impacts and ramifications through to the need potentially for having a public relations organization or public relations staff being brought to the table, and they start to build messages. So bias is a key one. And then reputational management, as I've sort of just touched upon. And so while this incident response is taking place, if things are getting serious enough, leadership will look to manage the reputation. You need to get the right message out, work with facts and not speculation, carefully frame messages, all while making, and all of this leads to one thing essentially, which is information. Lots and lots of information. So when we consider that, when we look at the whole information side of things, which we consider to be, it could be processes, workflows, technology, change management. Lots of different information is being brought to the table and being considered. This is where we start to think about what I've termed earlier as the unsung heroes. These are the people that I've come across a couple of times, and I will tell a tale momentarily of how this has come about, but they're not commonly seen around the incident response table, if you will. So, question: what is the most factual source commonly of information in organizations? It comes from everywhere, but if we step back and consider where is the non-traditional sources of information going to come from, we actually find it to be audit. And for a cybersecurity professional like myself to sort of look at this and go, well, audit are a great source. historically that's never really been the case when we consider incidents, but there is a reason for this. In internal audit, I looked at the definition of internal audit: systematic and disciplined approach to evaluate and improve effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. Well, really, these people actually are there to help when it comes to things like this, and they're rarely seen in incident investigation situations, but they're really valuable. I've found, and the reason this came about is that some time ago, in mid-2017, I was dealing with an incident situation, or we were, on behalf of a client, and we were there on site, and there was a new sort of technology lead CIO in place, and a couple of his staff were new as well, and they hadn't got their hands around the entire business yet. They were 1 or 2 weeks into the organization, which was quite considerable. And so questions from my team were being asked relevant to, where could we get certain types of information, from a technical perspective, who has access to what. Lots of questions were coming out very fast, and they were having to send people to try and find this information. And so we took a break from the war room we were working in, and as I strolled off to get a cup of coffee, I bumped into an old colleague who happened to be now part of the internal audit team for this sizable organization, and who happened to have a focus on IT controls. He asked what I was doing. I explained my circumstances and situation and why we were there. And I said, yeah, we're just waiting for things from the new IT business leads, so we can help to make some decisions and move things forward. And as we stood there in a hallway, he said to me, well, I have all of that. We've done controls audits, on a quarterly basis. I think they were doing them. He said, if you need to know who has access to what applications are there, what controls are around what applications, how do we keep logs? Where do we store them? How long? What's the retention period? He goes, I have all of that in a spreadsheet. So I brought this gentleman back into the room, together with reconvening the entire team. And the next hour was so immensely productive, because audit doesn't bring bias. They just are there to capture information and validate it's correct. That the conversation flowed quickly, and what was looking like it would take 1 or 2 days to get from an information perspective, I think we did in an hour or so. And it was that led to this thinking, that led to this type of presentation, actually, because I hadn't seen it in the past where audit had been pulled into an incident situation. I've sat in many war rooms trying to tackle things on behalf of clients like this. So audit became quite valuable. Now, I think one of the challenges with audits is that, it's not that there is a conflict, but we find that sometimes there can be a perception of conflict. Internal audit can be seen as challenging. They can be seen by the business, and I mean not the business leadership, but the business users, if you will, or operators, as challenging. It's just people don't have time. They don't want to have time. They have better things to do, things that they are measured upon. Spending time to sit with audit to tell them what controls you have in place, or how often you review a certain file, can be challenging. So we find that IT especially, and audit, can sometimes not be on the same page, which goes to, it does talk to why they're rarely there when there's a deep technical incident, because, IT are measured on keeping the lights on, the security teams are measured on having everything working right. They don't want to go back and revisit the people that they've had to answer questions to on many, many occasions that they believe are sort of tiring and not needed. So, quite practical here. And the business, rightly, though, see internal audit as just another function of we're all in it together for the greater good of the organization. But those on the ground, they don't always align for the reason that I've sort of mentioned before. And essentially that can create friction. And why, I guess, is always the question. Why? It's not surprising. And when we look at the way in which things change, and they do change rapidly, it means that security investigations professionals change the way in which they have to do things, but the tools and methods they use and the agile, lean approaches to combat security challenges aren't ones that audit can always keep up with. So let's take a look at a couple of those, because we're asking internal audit, essentially, to be cognizant of these things from a controls perspective and be able to opine as to whether the controls are relevant. Or cloud storage and computing, obviously something that's very common nowadays, but from a technical perspective, it's not a matter of just having a shopping list of things to look at. It's actually more complex than that, so very difficult. Machine learning or artificial intelligence processes and technology. Again, things that are coming to the front, so to speak, things that organizations are looking at, less so on the AI front, more on the machine learning front. But in security, machine learning is becoming quite a relevant thing at the moment. And if you are an organization, you bring machine learning, cybersecurity tools into your environment, audit are going to want to know how they work. They're going to want to understand, well, the outputs of these, how are we measuring and validating that they are correct? How is that technology being used for good and not for evil? And these are very challenging for audit. Agile and rapid approaches. Now, typically in most projects, as an example, I come from a consulting background. There is the waterfall approach, where you define what a project's going to look like. You're going to chunk it down into more palatable pieces. You're going to have some milestones and some endpoints for each one of those pieces, and have a sign-off and approval at the end. And it's a waterfall. It just keeps sort of going downwards. Agile doesn't work that way. Agile is something we see in all organizations now, or in many organizations. They're working in this agile manner, which means that they're looking at essentially a project in totality and measuring how far they are in all the relevant areas at any one time. Sometimes on a daily basis, they're doing these agile stand-up meetings and discussing how far they've got. From an audit perspective, that doesn't always work as well. How do you measure the success of a project, of an implementation, of a technological change, if it's not in that standard measure? So we're asking these fine folks to look at this sort of innovative things that are taking place and measure it, and they're not always as up to speed as we are. Then, of course, the compliance landscape, that's changing frequently, and we ask audit to help us understand how close we are from a compliance perspective. Well, GDPR, as of last month, that's complicated. In Canada here, and I know we have an international audience, but in Canada we have mandatory breach reporting coming into play as of November the 1st of this year. And so we say to audit, can you tell us, are we going to be okay? Can we do what we need to do to be able to achieve these regulatory requirements? And something as seemingly simple from a sounding perspective as mandatory breach reporting has so many technological components in the background and procedural changes that are required, things that are new, things that are different ways to approach things. Audit may not be familiar with it. They don't always understand them because they're new and constantly moving. And the process becomes frustrating on both sides, both the auditor and the auditee. And then finally, the evolving risk appetites. So these are things that are changing on a regular basis. The way in which we review, determine what risks we will accept, what risks we won't. Historically, if something went wrong on a Friday night, you'd have until Monday morning to fix it, and the business were okay. We can live with that. But the reality is nowadays that's not as simple because everything changes. The risk tolerances are much different. So the question that comes up most frequently is, why can't we combat this easier? And audit want to know why something more measurable might not be in place, and the business just assume that they can go and figure it out. There is complex technology. That's the first thing, as we just touched upon. Everything is changing. They need to get up to speed with it. We, as the business, need to be able to share things with them. The processes, they change very, very fast. Compliance requirements will help to formalize things, but new requirements come out all the time, so they change the landscapes. And then, of course, the people component. People, as we touched upon earlier, we trust things when we don't need to trust them. People aren't great at embracing new change. And sometimes, especially in the cyberspace, that can cause some things to break. So, where's this actually going? So, the way we look at this is, we need to bridge the audit and operations gap by building a true appreciation for each other's role. We see that as highly beneficial because we think there are some synergies. We definitely think there are some benefits and in having a firm and solid relationship, because sharing knowledge about the challenges and perspective from both sides is likely to result in much more positive interactions. So when considering incidents and investigations, essentially, using operational know-how and drawing on audit knowledge where needed could potentially result in essentially, the unthinkable. And the unthinkable being an actually truly collaborative approach, not everybody working in silos towards a common goal, but actually working together. So given the time here, I'm going to leave you with another short list before we move off. Knowledge transfer and cross-training is good. If each business unit or party has an appreciation and understanding of the goals and challenges faced by their counterparts, things will be better. So if ever the opportunity arises to, if you're in IT, if you're a technologist, if you can shadow the IT controls people from audit, you understand what they're doing. From an audit perspective, if you have the ability to put one of your technology auditors into operations, even for a brief period, so they understand what's going on, things will be better. Be flexible. Always be flexible. Both sides of the fence here, accept that cyber approaches now require that flexibility. They change continuously, and traditional approaches need to adapt. We've all got to be open to change and give more time, more time in general, invest more time to truly share context around requirements, architecture, processes. It's be embracing and be flexible. Evolve. There is a world outside these walls, and this one comes up quite a bit, where we walk into organizations and we see that they are focused on what they do, but then looking outside to see how other things are going. So we always tell people, keep an eye on how others do things. The cyber community is rich with knowledge, which is frequently shared. It's all readily available. So even taking a few minutes a week to understand how things are changing in technology and cybersecurity, is going to be beneficial. Don't assume that your way, not as an individual necessarily, but maybe as a company, is the right way. It just happens to be your way, the way that has been brought, you've been brought up, if you will, in that organization, the way that the organization has always done things. Sometimes there are other ways, and contribute back to the community where you can. Provide some fresh thinking. Let everybody benefit from your learnings. We do that as often as we can, and we see, when we have companies talk to other companies about what they've all done, it's very beneficial. And finally, it takes a village. It truly does. Essentially, we are all in it together. We collaboratively want to protect our organizations in the most sustainable manner. Everyone plays a part. And when things don't go to plan, or when incidents are occurring, it can take an entire team to course correct the situation or put the fires out and keep moving forward. And having that traditional team there, all collaborating under the watchful eye of audit, is actually something that we see to be very, very positive. So the unsung heroes in our mind sometimes are truly audit. So with that, I'm going to pass this back to Ardian.
Thank you, Jason, for this very insightful presentation. I want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for cybersecurity introduction, foundation, and lead cybersecurity manager. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing cybersecurity processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's session. The first question is, what is the quickest and best way to detect a data breach?
So that's a very good question. That's a very big question. The quickest and best way to detect a data breach is to have detective controls in place. So if we consider a typical enterprise environment, for example, you'd want to have the ability to find anomalies at your network level and anomalies at your host level, those being the endpoints, systems, computers. So having layers of controls in place that can identify anomalies, things that aren't normal in your environment, and having all of those technologies actually reporting to one central location so they can all be contextually understood is by far the quickest way to determine that a breach has taken place. The other way is to just wait for a member of staff to phone up and say something's not working, but we strongly don't recommend that.
Thank you, Jason. Another question is, what is the best tool for digital investigation that you would recommend?
Okay, so digital investigations fall into a couple of different areas. If we're talking about, we typically break it into like incident response, or things like just traditional investigations of systems or phones and such. So if we look at common suites of tools, you have things like X-ways forensics, for the analysis of systems. You have things like NCASE, FTK, IEF, or Axiom from Magnet. These are all large suites that are designed to look at data on systems usually. And those are all very, or quite costly. I'm not saying very, but they are corporate tools, they're commercial tools that require investment. If you're moving into this field and you want to just start experimenting with digital investigations and digital forensics, there are free and open source tools such as Autopsy, which is completely open source and is the Windows or Mac version of the Sleuth Kit, and that is equally as useful. It just doesn't have as many bells and whistles. And then from a corporate perspective, investigative tools could be things like Splunk, for example, where it's monitoring all of the data in the environment and it's looking at network traffic, and a combination of the endpoint investigative tools in tandem with the network review, the network focused investigative tools like Splunk will result in sort of the best picture for you.
Thank you, Jason. Another question is, can you provide a few tips towards a robust cyber incident response plan?
Yeah, I'll do my best. First thing when it comes to cyber incident response plans, governance. Somebody has to own it. Somebody has to be at the head of the head of the table, if you will. So when you're defining it, you must have obviously an owner. You must identify the roles and responsibilities of the parties that will be taking part in any incident response. I mentioned the term in my presentation of, say, crisis manager. That is just a generic term, but basically who's going to run any incident when it takes place. That doesn't necessarily mean, and this is something we've seen as an issue before, that the most senior people or the most senior person in the room, who's typically senior because of their operational role, such as a CFO or CEO, doesn't mean that they should be in charge of an incident. It's the person who has the most experience that should be identified as the crisis manager, and that person should help to build the roles for everyone else underneath them. Once you've actually built the roles and got the governance model in place, it's developing true procedures on how everybody will act and testing those procedures. So making sure that IT, if you will, or the operations technology people know what their role will be, know what their processes and procedures are. There should be something that's tested on a regular basis. And much like historically we used to do business continuity planning and disaster recovery testing, we do the same thing here, because you have to build for specific types of incidents. And I think understanding what the threats, the likelihood of threats are, and running tests on incident response for certain types of incidents, such as data leakage, or maybe ransomware, or possibly system integrity checking, where integrity is wrong on data, building several scenarios or playbooks as they're commonly called, and then testing them with all the staff that you've just given roles to, that's managed by the crisis manager, is the simplest approach. Although that was a long response, so it may not be that simple, but that's the general way to do it.
Thank you, Jason. Now, because of the time limitation, we will only answer one more question. The last question is, in the assignment of roles in data administration, are there risks involving foreign employees?
So if I've understood that correctly, we're talking about, I think, where you've given people administrative privilege, and essentially, we're considering there's a risk potentially to that. I think that's what the question was. Is that right, Ardian? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, I think it also involves outsourcing, maybe. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we're considering elevated privileges and outsourcing that to third parties, and I'm not sure the way the question's going, but I'm going to assume that is it. So my apologies if it's not. If we're considering giving third parties access to administer your environment, yes, there is always a risk with that. However, that risk can be mitigated through a very, some simple or some straightforward steps. The first is, as an organization, you will undoubtedly have a risk tolerance, and you will have a set of controls in place that advise how your administrators should function. So you're going to have basically a checklist to make sure that they do the right thing and that they can't go beyond any certain steps in some way, shape, or form. Whatever you use to measure your own competency and your ability to protect the business from any rogue administrators or people getting administrative accounts inadvertently, you must apply those same measures to third parties. And we see from a vendor management perspective, sometimes it's not as robust. We're not looking to apply real security thinking to the way that vendors work with us. So there is a risk, in answer to your question, but it can be mitigated by actually coming up with a vendor checklist from a security perspective and having them provide you evidence. You could even use audit to do this, provide you evidence on how they control things. How do they manage their people who are administrating your environment? What are controls that are there? Are they reviewed on a regular basis? Are there logs of everything they do? How do they capture it? Don't be afraid to ask, because everybody understands the importance of security. So I think that's vital.
Yeah, so thank you, Jason, once again for this great set of Q&A session. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel together with the slides of the presentation. For more information, you can visit our website www.pcb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.